Hi everyone, welcome to week 9. This week we're covering competition law. Here we're looking at the rules that govern the way that organisations operate in relation to one another. In this video, we'll focus on the key concepts that underpin competition law, while in later videos we'll examine the different kinds of anti-competitive conduct and legislative responses to that conduct. Overarching our discussion of competition regulation is an ideological debate about the government's role in regulating the market. You may be familiar with some of these discussions from other courses, but broadly the two poles are that at one end of the spectrum, the government should do absolutely nothing to regulate the market. It's the Wild West, free for all, but that's okay, because rational choice and consumer behaviour will cause the market to self-regulate. Prices will go no higher than people will pay. Organisations play survival of the fittest, but the lack of regulation means that new competition can always start up, for example. At the other end of the spectrum, we have complete government regulation, which starts to sound a lot like socialism. We can debate the merits of each, but as a very broad generalisation, we can say that human experience has demonstrated that neither extreme is especially desirable or has worked especially well. Instead, most people would agree that we need some kind of government intervention, but the exact amount is a tough balance. Too much regulation, and we take away the incentives for business to invest and innovate, and we stifle entrepreneurship. Too little regulation, and consumers suffer, being taken advantage of by ruthless corporations and vast monopolies. Politically speaking, we tend to find left-wing parties like the Australian Labor Party favouring more regulation, and right-wing governments like the Liberal Party seeking less. But, as I say, that's an ideological debate, and perhaps one that we can discuss in the workshops if you're interested. But for now, what's important is to think about the different types of measures that we examine, and evaluate where they strike the balance between market freedom and market regulation. Do they do a good job, or are they skewed too far one way or the other? And it's something to think about and evaluate. Our first clue about the balance in Australia comes from Section 2 of the Competition and Consumer Act, which tells us that the objective of the Act is to enhance the welfare of Australians through promotion of competition and fair trading and provision for consumer protection. So this tells us that the CCA puts the consumer as its focus and is therefore more likely to favour their interests than businesses' interests in the free market. It won't come as a shock to you that the laws were introduced in 2010 by a Labor government. For the remainder of this video, we'll focus on two really important concepts: competition and the market. Competition is not clearly defined in the Act, but instead is considered a loose term that can be shaped to the facts. Professor Maureen Brunt, sitting as President of the Trade Practices Tribunal in Queensland Cooperative Milling Association, offered two connotations from the word competition that continue to offer good guides. The first is that it's efficient and progressive. Here, it might help you to think of Darwin's theory of evolution. All creatures are in constant competition with one another, for food, for mates, for shelter, everything. The creatures that survive and thrive are the ones that are best adapted to their surroundings, and that adaptation requires efficiency and progressiveness. Nature is all about being as efficient as possible, using the least amount of energy to achieve the most outcomes. For better or worse, it's the same in business. A business that can produce more goods at a lower cost, or with fewer staff, or with less wastage, will do better than a more inefficient business. And that's the essence of competition, according to Brunt. You beat your competitors by being more efficient than them. The way that you get more efficient is by being progressive, by testing new techniques, new marketing strategies, new training procedures, whatever it is. The point is that a business must progress in order to keep pace with or beat their competition, and we see that more clearly in the 21st century than any other point in history. The sheer pace at which new technologies and ideas are being developed is staggering. According to Brunt, the second connotation from competition is that efficiency and progressiveness are achieved through impersonal market pressures. Again, the analogy to nature and evolution is useful here. Nature isn't personal. Watch any wildlife documentary and you'll see countless examples of that. Sick gazelle that can't outrun the lion, dead. It's literally survival of the fittest. This applies in business because the market is also impersonal. It can be just as unforgiving as nature, and success is driven by a business's ability to be efficient and progressive. There are exceptions, of course, because in the business world we're dealing with humans, and humans are personal, but as a general rule we see that efficiency and progressiveness being what succeeds. A great example is the growth of online retail at the expense of brick and mortar shops. Online stores do really well because they're more efficient. They have fewer overheads, they're able to offer goods at a lower price, and are more progressive because they're incorporating developments in technology. At a personal level, we probably feel a bit bad for people struggling in retail jobs, and we'd like to support them by going into a shop rather than buying something online. But when we can get the exact same thing for a lower price, conveniently delivered to your home, how often do we actually trudge into the store? How many people will breeze through self-serve checkouts over waiting and waiting to be served by a person? Efficiency, progressiveness, and the impersonal market. That's competition. The other important concept for this week is the market. The market is not clearly defined, but it might help you to think of a market being a space, whether physical or not, where competition occurs. This involves considering 4 dimensions. First, the product. What types of goods and services are on offer? This is usually fairly straightforward, as manufacturers or sellers of the same type of goods will be in competition with one another. Apple and Samsung, Coles and Woolworths, etc. But the question can become more complex when we broaden our comparison. Is a motorcycle company like Harley-Davidson in competition with a car company like Ford? On the one hand, no, the products are different, cars or bikes. But on the other hand, they are in competition in the wider market of vehicle manufacturing. So it's important to look at the product, but not be limited to a direct comparison, and to consider all the surrounding facts and circumstances. Second, function is also important. At what point in the supply chain does the business operate? Generally, for instance, we would expect manufacturers to be in competition with other manufacturers, and retailers to compete with other retailers, but manufacturers are usually not in competition with retailers. Geography, so the place in which an organisation operates, can also be a good indicator of the market. However, we have to be careful here, as advancements in globalism and technology mean that competitors are not locked into specific regions. Depending on the type of product, competitors can be global, or at the very least Australia-wide, but equally we can't just assume that everyone is a competitor for everyone else. A good example might be a destination activity like scuba diving. 2 dive operators in the same area, say Cairns, will clearly be in competition with one another. But in a sense, they're also competing with dive operators in Brisbane, trying to attract tourists and divers to their location rather than going somewhere else. Finally, the period of time might also be relevant to the market. This is especially important for goods that expire quickly or that are not easily substitutable in a short time frame. Services where time is of the essence, such as emergency repairs or a tow truck, might also have their markets determined by a reference to a time frame, such as the amount of time it would realistically take a tow truck to get out to an accident, or a plumber to get to a burst pipe. Anyone outside that time window is probably not a competitor and probably therefore not in that market. These discussions highlight yet again how important the facts are. It's hard to say exactly what a market is because it will depend so heavily on the facts that are unique to each business. A good strategy for understanding market is to read through the cases that are listed in your study guide, and then to think of other scenarios that might lead to either the same outcome or different outcomes. For instance, think of Singapore Airlines and Traperbane Tours Western Australia, where the court held that the market covered packaged tours of island holiday destinations, not just packaged tours of the Maldives. How would Chief Justice French's reasoning apply to, say, a wedding planner who organises destination weddings in Bali? What would their market be, and what would their competition be? Or, a bit further removed, let's consider a hotel manager in Adelaide who organises vineyard tours in South Australia. What are the relevant markets there? How broad or narrow are they? These are the types of questions to ask yourselves in critically thinking about the concepts of market and competition. That concludes our first video for this week. We'll see you in part 2.